Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Prometheus Chats. Today, I'm very excited to be with an author that I really enjoy reading. I hope all of you who've listened here will enjoy if you haven't read him or have already enjoyed one of his books. But it's the renowned JKS Manga, whose real name is not JKS. So, Jack Sherwin is who we'll be talking to today. He is, if you don't know, an author who is known for writing mostly lit RPG and I guess fantasy work is how I would define it. And you sold, if I remember, like 15 million copies worldwide, something ridiculously huge, which is really impressive. And especially in this day, if people say no one reads, but clearly people are reading when you're writing, so that's a great thing. And several of his works, his web novels, have been turned into comic books, which is also something very near and dear to my heart. So aside from rambling on and on and on about Jack and his many accomplishments, I think I will let Jack do the rest of this intro and talk about his novels, and then we'll get into like some of his background story and how he got to be where he is. So thank you so much, Jack. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me on, Damion. As you did a great introduction. Yeah, so my name is Gowan Jack Sherwin, or JKS Manga Jack Gowan Sherwin. So that's where the comes from. The sales thing is a little bit strange with the numbers as well because it's actually you. A lot of my works aren't in physical book form, so it's more like digital sales, right? Also, the number is a lot higher now because I think that was written around 2 years ago, but now that's just what Google has like plastered everywhere if you search me up. But yeah, most people know me for writing a story called My Vampire System. That's my most popular series. It wasn't my first work, but that's how people get introduced to me, and then they kind of introduced to this whole world of web novel writing and things like that.
Thank you so much. And that's actually even more impressive. I think that that marks one of the transitions we've seen a lot in publishing is that the physical copies of books, etc., aren't necessarily what people are new to buy. The digital consumption is really what it seems to be driving. Is that something that you intentionally wanted to move into? Did you intentionally go into writing thinking I'm going to be more of a digitally focused artist or print, or was that just organic?
It was actually like more natural, so there wasn't a conscious decision, and the reason for that being is I actually never thought that I would be a writer. I never like it wasn't when I was a kid. It never was like, oh, you know what, I want to go university and study writing and become an author. Instead, I chose the musician path. But that in my head felt just as hard because in my head it was like, well, only the big authors really make it or can make a living off it. And same with music. It was like, okay, only the big authors can make it. But in music, I had a fallback. It was like, if I don't make it as a rock star, then I will go into teaching. And that's basically what I did. I was teaching. But I always say this because my Vampire System, which is the main series I wrote, is 4.5 million words, which is about 5 times bigger than the entire Harry Potter series. So it's about 40 books worth.
Uh-huh.
Now, no, if you are working full time, you got a full time job, it's very hard to keep motivated to write a whole book like 100,000 or 200,000 words because there's nothing to keep you going other than just, oh, I want to write a book. So it was
Mhm.
kind of the natural selection of, oh, you know what, there's these platforms where you can just write a chapter a day. So that's that was naturally what got into me. I was just like, oh, I'll just write a chapter a day. That's doable for me. I can go work, go back, write a chapter a day, and then upload it online. And then when you're not making money at the beginning, it's all the comments, it's all the views, it's all the subscribers. You're like, okay, there's people actually reading my work. Let's write more of this story. So it wasn't a conscious decision to be like, let's either do web novels or book format. It was just with our busy lives, the web novel format was the only thing that was kind of doable.
Then to your point, when you think about it, it is extremely long, but that's actually one of the things that's been really great about it, at least from a reading perspective, that I had this series that felt almost like a weekly comic book or something that I could come back to all the time. And there was always something new that was waiting for me. It's almost like the never ending television series in a way, because it keeps giving you more of what you want. which as a reader is really engaging. But for you as a writer, was that something that you had at least planned out ahead of time, or were you planning it as you were going as well?
So there's kind of in the this web novel community, there's two types of writers, and we call them plotters and pantsers. And I am actually a plotter. So with all my series, I write the whole overlying arcs, the main volumes that are going to be. So I know the ending point of each part of the story, and then that way I can always have the characters move towards that end point in that story. Now, the finer details aren't so strict. I'm not planning every single thing because characters will go off to other stuff. I might have a good idea in the middle, but it's still moving towards this one point. And because of that, the story still feels like it's moving. Because I feel like that's what a lot of people make the mistake of. If they're just writing daily, they'll come to their computer and it's like, okay, where do I go now? And when they're reading those long stories, it's like they don't feel like it's progressing in any way. And even in a long story format, you have to want it to feel like it's progressing. And for me, I always grew up loving the really long anime, which is why my name's Manga. The anime format, like Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, all these what series that are like 300 episodes long, were my favorite types of series where you just fall in love with the world and you don't ever want it to end. Like you just want it to keep going. You're like, I want to find out every detail. So that's what I try to do with my story. With the other thing you were talking about, that's the other thing is with the audience, because you're writing chapters and not a whole book, the way you have to write it is completely different. If someone buys a whole book, they've already committed to the purchase. So you can have a slow start, you can have these slow moments in a book and then an interesting development in the beginning and then twist and then end. But with a web novel, chapter by chapter, you need the audience to come back every day almost. So if you remember like back in the olden anime days, it'd be like next on Dragon Ball Z and leave you on like a cliffhanger. You essentially have to do that in the novel. You have to be like, okay, the dun dun dun, and then people have to either wait the next day to read the next chapter or just like go on to the next episode. And before you know it, you've read like hundreds of
Mhm.
chapters.
I have to admit there are several nights where I stayed up later than I should have to find out what happens to Quinn in the next chapter, and then there's this whole new plot twist that happens, and I'm like, "No, I have to stay up now." But that's a really for me, it's always nice to hear people are plotters because that's completely my style. I do the same as well, but several of my friends who are writers are pantsers, and so they're kind of, well, we'll get there when we get there, and wherever there is, we'll figure it out. And they're
Yeah.
still really great writers. I don't have the mental capacity to keep track of what I was doing to take that approach. For you, where did the inspiration for, well, the whole series come from? So my dragon system, my vampire system, my werewolf system, because it mixes several different popular elements right now in what some would call geek culture, nerd culture, where there's some gaming elements in there, there's some fantasy elements in there, and there are science fiction elements as well.
Yeah, well, the first in my series was my dragon system, which wasn't as popular as my vampire system, but still did well. It was like top 50 in on the web novel app. On that also has a system which is the whole lit RPG genre, which has kind of exploded. And like you said, I think it was myself as well. I honestly can't remember what story I was reading, but the first time I saw lit RPG, I was like, oh, this is really addictive way of storytelling. And a lot of people in web novel think I kind of started the trend on web novel of system stories, but I was definitely not the first one. But when I read it, it was like, oh, this I want to write this type of story. I like the gaming aspect in real life. I've always been fans of games, especially RPGs, and to have that, there's always that imagination of like, oh, what would you do if you were a game character? Like when you're playing games, it's that self insert, and then when you write a novel, it's like, oh, you know what, you can actually do it yourself. You can explore the whole world. You can do the whole thing. So that was what it started with Dragon System, which was kind of like my experiment into lit RPGs. But with Vampire System, it was completely different because it was like, okay, what do I really like? My dad grew up watching Blade and Underworld or Otherworld, sorry, and Vampire Diaries, also all those sorts of shows. And then it was like, oh, there's not a lot of action vampire stories out. If the last big series was Twilight, and in my head I was like, well, I like the action, vampire series, so let's write something like that. And then like you said, is so strange because people ask me all the time, it's like, oh, what's your book about? And it's like, if I explain to them it's space in the future, there's vampires, everyone's got superpowers and they're fighting aliens, they would be like, what is going on? So it's a hard sell if you explain what the what story is about. So you have to break it down like, okay, it's about vampires with a gaming system. That's the core element which attracts people. And then when they learn, it's like, oh, there's a war going on, there's this, like you said, there's sci-fi elements, there's VR gaming. It really brings people in. I literally just took one of the biggest influences for that was another story called Super Gene, which
Mhm.
is a Chinese web novel that was based in the future. So that's why that was based, yeah, like sci-fi elements, soft sci-fi elements, which is what I wanted to put into my work. That's what I did with that. And then the vampire law and everything, it just kind of came naturally, honestly, going from there.
That's, I mean, so many things. You touched on some really key points around how there are some ships in different genres, and it allowed you to kind of play with multiple genres and mash them up in a way that was new and unique. And lit RPG is an example of something that came out of interests that were not necessarily fiction or even literature, taking those interests now and injecting them into a literary work and building a whole world and genre around it. Coming into it, you mentioned that you didn't want to initially be a writer, you wanted to be a musician. So to go from musician to writer, not a huge leap, but at some point there had to be a turning point where you go, you know what, I'm going to give this writing thing a try. What was that moment for you? How did you make the switch from sort of writing as a test to actually writing novels?
Yeah, so unfortunately, maybe this is the answer that not a lot of creative people want to hear, but it's the money or the income. So, but I don't mean that in a bad way. And when I explain, it'll probably make more sense. The like you said, the fields are quite similar. It's still creative process, right? Like creating music, creating stories, and I loved stories from young. It was just so unbelievable to be a writer that I never even thought of trying it. And I was really into comics more, like webtoons and manga. And at the time, there is now more of an industry for the West, but at the time it was near impossible for Western creators to get into the manga or webtoon industry because they're all locked up with Korean companies and Japanese companies, and they
Mhm.
weren't even branching out internationally. Even now it's a struggle, even though anime is bigger than it's ever been internationally. But yeah, so I started with that. And actually, that's really so. While doing music, I always did that on the side, and it was just like if it becomes something, then that's great. But it's harder to make money with that because you have to pay for artists. The content to sell is a lot less because it takes a week to make a chapter, and then you need so many chapters to get a volume. So by the time that there's just so much work that needs to be done into that industry before receiving any sort of income. So it's nearly impossible to make it a full time job. So I kind of stopped. And originally, when I was a teacher, you get a lot of time over summer holidays, things like that. It was like I saw on Web Novel, they were like, "Oh, we'll pay you so much to write so much. Like they'll give you a flat fee, and then whatever you sell, you'll make more." And I thought, "Oh, this is great! I can use this money to pay for the artists for the
Mhm.
comic series." So I just wrote, but then the money on novels was just a lot higher than on comics. So and then there does become this point where you're earning when you're doing this, I don't know, side hustle or creative job, that it becomes equal to what you're earning in your day job. But
Mhm.
still, even though it's equal, you're reluctant to quit because there's this uncertainty that maybe you won't be making this income forever because it's kind
Mhm.
of like your own business and it requires some people buying your work, but the teacher job is stable, right? But then what happened was literally I released my vampire system. It went straight to rank one. And then I was earning triple or quadruple what I would earn in a teaching job. So it was like, and I had this rule to myself because I kept asking my friends, I was like, what do I do? And they were like, look, just wait 6 months. And then after 6 months, if the income is still good, then quit your job. But, but it kind of got to me like, but if I quit, I'll have more time to write. If I have more time to write, it's something I enjoy, love doing, and I'll be able to earn more, writing as well. So that cross field, in the end, I decided to. I think I broke my own rules, and after 2 months, I decided to just quit the teaching job. Luckily, my wife was very supportive as well. She was like, "Yeah, go for teaching, things like that. Sorry, go for writing. Happy to do that." And it all worked out in the end. It's now been 5 years, 6 years, full time writing, and yeah, it's interesting. I think if I didn't quit, I might have not had enough time to write. And sometimes you have to jump on that momentum, and especially in the web novel space. And if you
Mhm.
lose that momentum, that might be like kind of like your 15 minutes of fame. You can make that a lifetime of fame. But if you don't jump on it, then you might make nothing of that 15 minutes of fame.
I remember one of the things that I found really kind of inspiring is when you were writing My Vampire System. I remember seeing your notes that you had put, like, "Oh, I'd like to make this my full-time career. I want to be a full writer. We're doing blah blah blah. Or next week this is going to happen." And it was fun to watch you take that journey and move into becoming a full-time writer. Because when I first started reading, I go, "Oh, this is great. This guy's gonna wants to be a writer. I want him to succeed." And then very shortly afterwards, it was suddenly, "Hey, I'm writing now," and it was I don't want to say an abrupt transition, but it was really rapid because the series did grow really quickly. I remember hearing people talking about it, and I was shocked because not very many people are that deep into web novels to really know the name of something that I would know, but also that it was coming up with people who were completely not in my usual circle. For example, my business partner's brother was reading it, and he's like, "Oh, I'm really into lit RPG. There's this new book called My Vampire System," and we were talking about some sales thing completely not related, and it was all about work. And then he just happened to mention it, and next thing you know, I'm meeting all these people who had read it, knew about it, and I started telling people, and so it was a really rewarding journey. And for you, I was curious to find out what was that like being able to kind of publicly talk about where you wanted to go and kind of state your goal and really pushing towards it. Because for some people, that's vulnerability. For some people, it's how they keep themselves accountable. And then for others, it's kind of a mix of both.
It is difficult because I remember talking to my wife about it as well. Because she was my wife, so my decisions also affect. It's not just affecting you; it's affecting another person. And I even said to her, "Look, for the next 3 years, we're not going to go on holidays. We're not gonna, like just give me 3 years to really work at this and have make this type of thing grow." And yeah, I just went. I didn't take holidays, and but sometimes you see the frustrating side because I don't know if you remember that there's kind of two different audiences now because thankfully what happened is Web Novels licensed it to Pocket FM, and now the audio series has blown up hugely as well. And now it's kind of had a second wave, which is even bigger than the first wave. And I have the same experience as you now. It's like people in that don't read manga, don't read anime, don't read books are knowing about the story, which is absolutely crazy. But still not my friends or family because whenever I get interviewed, they'll ask my wife, they'll ask my friends, "Have you read his book?" It's like no, it hasn't. So, but they're supportive. It's just not their thing. Hopefully, it goes into a TV or something like that where they would they would consume it. But yeah, what I was going to say was when I was starting writing, it would get frustrating because I would give my all for the readers. So it would be like, look, I know they really want content, so I wrote 3 chapters a day, while everyone else was writing 1 chapter a day. And then on weekends, I would write like 8 or 9 chapters to like it was like, oh, you support me, you guys are helping me, I'll help you out. But then what would happen is like something will happen in real life. I have eye surgery, I have to go to the hospital, things like that. Things come up all the time, and then I would upload one instead of 3 chapters, and then people would be like, "What?" And then you see all the comments going like, "I pay for this," or etc. And it's really hurtful because it's like, well, even though because I remember this, I had eye surgery, and they said don't look at a screen for like 24 hours. I still wrote a chapter because I didn't want to let down those fans. Even when me and my wife got married, we went on a honeymoon. I wrote chapters as well. I think the only day I didn't write a chapter was my actual wedding day. So, I mean, even now on this holiday, I'll be writing as well. So yeah, it's that is the hard bit with when you get all these flood of comments thinking like, oh, you're not working hard enough because they only see the content, they don't see what's happening behind the content.
And that's important, I think, for a lot of people to understand is the amount of dedication and sacrifice you had to go through in order to be able to create and release a web novel so consistently with such a long and robust story. What was that experience like for you? Did you find it particularly challenging, or were you in the zone and then coming back now looking at, wow, that was a lot?
It would go through phases. So sometimes it would be quite easy to write, like you said, in the zone. When I was working, because people ask me all the time, it was like, well, how did you do it? When I was working, I would wake up at 6 a.m., write 2 chapters, and then after finishing teaching for a day, write another chapter when I get back from the school. So that was how I did it then. If anything, actually, it's kind of harder to write now because you get this momentum when the story is doing well and it's not your full-time job, and it's like, oh, this can become my full-time job, and that momentum and adrenaline keeps you going, like, oh, this can become really big. But then when it is your full-time job and you're essentially self-employed, you're the one that has to every discipline yourself. So every day you got to write, you got to, still do the work, because I can easily as well just, not write today, not write tomorrow, because there's no one forcing you to write. So even back then, Vampire System is doing well. I probably could have written less, but yeah, it's now that you're in the position of like, okay, it's your full time job. It's that forcing yourself, like, okay, I've got to do my chapters today. Your friends ask you out because they, and then you got to say, well, I haven't done this work. But really, there's no boss telling you you need to do this work. It's it's yourself that you've got to discipline yourself. And I think people find that very difficult, especially if you've never done that before. It's very easy when I was a teacher to just come in at 9 o'clock and say, okay, I've got to teach all these lessons now, compared
Mhm.
to, okay, you've got to hit this quota. And writing is a strange thing, which is, I think, another thing people don't understand, because when they read it, they read the chapter in 5 minutes or so. Sometimes it can take a very long time to write a lot of chapters. Sometimes it is easy. So yeah, it's very difficult.
And one of the things that about writing, and I remember I discovered this. So during the pandemic, I had lots of free time apparently, and I started writing a series, and it's a very solitary endeavor. I had a friend who was writing it with me, but we weren't sitting in the same room and talking or anything. I'd write a piece, he'd write a piece, I'd write a series, he'd write an episode, and we kind of come together and edit. Did you find in that process that you felt isolated, or was it that you were just so focused that you didn't really have that experience while you were writing?
I would say so. During the time, I would say not feel so isolated. Now I do, especially now it's been 5 or 6 years of doing the same thing. You don't go into an office, you don't have work colleagues, you don't have this other social life aspect. Being an artist, I mean, the people in this industry always talk about this all the time, but being an author and art is a very lonely road as you're writing the work yourself. I mean, luckily, I do think thanks to the internet, things are better. Like, all the authors on Web Novel have a Discord community, so you can talk to other authors and ask for feedback. It's still not quite the same as socially being with someone in person. The other thing is, it was particularly a bit harder for me because at the time I was teaching music in China, and the lockdowns at that time were really strict, and I can't speak Chinese. So I already have this, like, I don't have a lot of social aspect in my life. So even to not have that through work, it,
Like,
it is it is quite hard to have that. But on the flip side, like you said, you were working with someone. I work with some people on other projects that I do, like Just the Goblin, which is on a webtoon. And I actually realized I probably prefer working on my own than working with others.
that's always a funny thing where you look for, oh, it'll be great to collaborate, and it always ends up being much more work than you anticipated, and rewarding, but not the same as when you just did it by yourself.
Yeah.
So let's to transition to a little bit about the business and the financial realities. You talked about transitioning from teaching and how you would set goals. Do you mind walking through how does novel monetization work for web novels? Because I think a lot of people don't know. They assume it's going to be like YouTube and you'll get ad revenue, or do you just get paid up front, or how does it really work?
Yeah, this is actually very interesting, because the monetization aspect of web novels is completely different to Western apps that we've had in the past, and things like that. But it's very common in Asia, like very common in Japan, very common in China, very common in Korea. And it's the number one complaint I see all the time about, well, why don't you guys just have a subscription and can read it as much as possible? But yeah, I'll start from the beginning. So I talked about originally. So usually these companies, to entice you to start writing, they will say if you do X amount of words, they'll give you a flat fee, and the flat fee is like $400 or $200, which is really not something anyone can live on. But if you ever notice, the start of web novels is always free to read. So about the
Mhm.
first 60 chapters or so. So you have to write for free at the beginning, no matter what, because you can't make
Uh,
money until you can start selling chapters. And then what they usually do then is lock after a certain amount of chapters. So I think for Vampire System, it's like after 64. And they kind of, it's up to you as the author, but what you want to do is entice them enough into the story where they're already hooked enough, they want to buy. Like if you locked it after 5 chapters, then they don't know the characters, they don't want to know what happens next, they'll just go move on to something else. So there's this sweet spot of, okay, you've been interested, invested in the story enough, now you got to unlock the next chapters to read it. And now, usually, typically, what it is most online platforms like this, the revenue is 50-50 of whatever of net profit. So, this is another thing people don't get confused about as well, because the net profit is very important compared to gross profit.
oh yeah.
Um, so 50% sounds great, right? So if someone spends $100 unlocking chapters on my vampire system, people are like, oh, I should get $50. It's like, no. You won't get $50. But so first, as I said, so when you start locking chapters, every new chapter you release, people have to purchase, and then you will get 50% of the net profit. And this is, in reality, it's basically closer to 28% of what the consumer spends, because annoyingly as it is, Apple, most purchases are through app stores, and Apple and Google take a 30% cut of whatever is used in the app store. And then there's just like background fees and stuff like that, and then in the end you get about 28%. So if someone spent $100 on my book, I would get about $28 to myself. But that's still typically higher than traditional publisher deals, which is closer to the 9% to 15% mark for hardcover books in bookstores. So there's a balance to all these things. But yeah, that's why what it focuses on, like, ongoing stories. So when you get a fan base that's following you, then you make most of your revenue from, let's say you have 5,000 readers. Every two, if you release 2 chapters a day, then your readers will have to pay for those 2 chapters. And then every day they're paying for those 2 chapters. And that's how you kind of get your monthly income, rather than a typical book deal where they're one time purchasing for the whole book. So it's definitely a more consistent way of earning, because it's always ongoing until you finish the book, compared to, oh, you've released a book on Amazon, now you got to wait a few months and then release the next book on Amazon. So it's more sustainable that way.
It seems like to me, I know I've looked at webtoons. There are several different platforms that are very similar, but through all of them, the way that they work, it feels like you're building a relationship with your audience, and it to some extent forces you to be very cognizant of what they like, what they want, and the story you want to tell, and threading that needle. So it's a fine balancing act between giving them something unexpected and that will delight them, but also giving them something that's expected enough that they're going to want to keep paying for it. And
Yeah.
they're going to trust you with this story. Did you find it to be that way as well? Because I feel like when I'm reading a web novel, I'm much more committed and dedicated to that author than I would be just, I picked up this book at the airport and I'm just reading it.
It's definitely a different reading experience, because you grow with the story. Like if you see the story rising, you're there. And not just that, every chapter you have people commenting on every single chapter, right? So you can have people going like, oh, what do you think is going to happen next, what do you think? And then the next chapter is like, oh my god, this happened. So it really feels like you're experiencing something together with everyone and with the author. And that's what I try to explain as well, is it's a completely different experience from reading a book. So the pricing has to be kind of different to it, to a traditional book as well. You can't compare them as apples to apples. And a lot of people don't understand the format. Even Amazon, when they released Kindle Vella, I think it was, they saw that all these platforms are doing well. They tried to release their own version, and it is done horribly. But that's partly due to them not understanding the format, and also the authors, because what authors were doing was they were just taking their books that they wrote already and then releasing a chapter a week on them. And it's like, well, you're not, like you said, you're not building anything. You're not, and there's still the whole book that they can purchase. So it's completely different experience, and no wonder it doesn't do that well for authors. And yeah, so on that aspect, it seemed like even a huge company like Amazon didn't really understand the market, and neither did they try to explain to the authors to try understand the market as well.
One of the things that now that you've started to see success with your novels, a lot of people, when they start to see that success, find it difficult to balance the doing what you love and trying to understand what would be commercially or financially successful. How do you balance that in your writing now?
So I always tell people this, that I'm quite lucky that I like mainstream stuff. so so I do write what I enjoy, and I think if it might come across that as well. You know, nothing feels too forced and not randomly inserted because it's something you didn't. So luckily, I do write what I enjoy, and I like mainstream stuff. So it's not too much a problem for me. But I do see it all the time where people, especially like web novels, have its own market space compared to Amazon. And you get a lot of Amazon authors trying to move to web novel. And it's like, no, you can't write like that. It's like that's not the style of writing, you know. And it's like, well, I want to write like that. And then it's like, yeah, and then they'll be like, it's if they don't want to buy it, then they don't have to buy it. And it's like, well, what's your goal here? Do you want to become an author or not? You know, it's like, and you can always I think it really depends as well, because I tell people, like, do you have, if you're a very creative person, you have more than one story that you want to tell in your mind, a bit like you have more than one song. But for some reason in the author space, they get really attached to that one story that they've written, which would be crazy if you thought of it like a song. Like they've just got this one song and it's like, no, I have to only release it to this publisher, or you know, but they should look at more of it like music, like just get it out there and then see the feedback. But yeah, as you were saying, the trends at the moment, like especially for romance and action, they do change quite a lot, and sometimes people get fatigued and then it moves on to the next thing. Like Eastern fantasy was really popular on web novel, and then it moved to LitRPG, and then it moved to VR games, and now it's moved into like anti-hero, and it changes all the time. But the best thing to do, which obviously everyone would love to do, is starting that trend. So kind of like, oh, I saw no one wrote about vampires, so I wrote about vampires first, and then a whole load of vampire stories come out after mine. But if everyone had that and everyone had a crystal ball, then then that would be great. But yeah, it's for me, I was lucky. But I do say to people, like, you know, the first thing you should do, whatever platform you go on, is read the current top works, because that's what's currently doing well. And then and I always tell people as well, especially if you don't like the story, definitely read it, because there's a reason why that's popular. If you don't like it, then maybe you will be able to even evaluate it even better to find out why do other people like it.
That's great advice. I don't think enough time is spent in talking about creative work and, for lack of a better term, doing your research. So it's okay to look at what other people are doing, understanding the lay of the land, what's popular, what's not popular. And especially if you're doing it in with the concern of making money or having it be some sort of a commercially viable project, you need to understand what people are willing to pay for, and taking that into consideration is huge because now you know what audiences are willing to pay for. Doesn't mean you have to do that same thing, but you can at least even potentially break down the elements that make it popular so that you can do your version of what that is or do something better.
Yeah, and you can always do passion projects after. Like there's no, like, if you, like, I love horror, but horror doesn't do well in web novels, so I would never release on web novel. But you know, if you write a popular work, then you have time to write horror on the side. The other thing I love about web novels long format, and this is part of when you said you saw all these different aspects. Sometimes you get bored writing one story, and as a creative person, you want to write, like, that's the worst thing. People are like, oh, I want to start another story, want to start another story, rather than sticking to the one story. But then, so say if I want to write some survival contest thing, then I just put it in vampire system. Oh, if I want to write something VR, then I'll just put it in vampire system, and that kind of lets the creativeness stick to that one story. It's like you can always have horror elements. Like I was reading a load of detective series at one point, so I thought like, oh, it'd be fun to have like a more detective bit inside Vampire System and stuff like that. And I think that's a way for the readers not to get fully bored of the same thing happening all the time as well.
That's a great idea, and it also breathes new life into whatever genre you're doing, right? It doesn't have to stick to the formulaic, "This is what the genre has," and when you bring those additional elements for an audience, it brings that factor of, "Wow, this is," like, it's a wow factor or delight that you didn't expect, which is one of the things that's most attractive about a good book for a lot of people. Not everyone wants to read a book where they know exactly what's going to happen, repeat.
Yeah.
How much have you how much did writer feedback play into how you developed the story and some of the plot lines and the way things were executed in actually any of your web novels?
So for me, not too much. I actually try. I have this saying of like a lot of readers don't know what they want, and the popular case I always use is One Punch Man, where in that series is really strong, and everyone wants, but no one knows he's really strong, and everyone's like, just let everyone know he's really strong. Like, why can't? And it's like, well, that's what's keeping you reading. As soon as everyone finds out that One Punch Man is One Punch Man, then you're gonna stop reading. So if you focus on the comments too much, that can sometimes be a negative. It's hard to filter between what is actually constructive feedback and what is just like readers being impatient in the moment. So for me, I try, because I had those plotted outlines, I tried to keep it as much as possible. I had to kind of believe in, I always said this, my Vampire System had horrible comments at the beginning, and if I had listened to those, I would have never continued writing my Vampire System. Luckily, the comments and the sales were two different things. So I knew people were enjoying it because people were buying it. But if you did just look at the comments or reviews at the time, it was horrendous. But and now it's kind of flowed out of that a bit.
Did you do any marketing or promotions to get people to start reading it when you first released, actually, whether when you first released it or even afterwards, continual?
That's the great thing about these web novel systems compared to something like Amazon, because if you self-publish on Amazon, you're just placing it into the void, and you really have to do all the work. You have to do the marketing, you have to get it out there, go to Facebook groups, and unless you just want your friends and family to buy it, no one's ever going to see it. So but the great thing about these platforms like web novel and these apps is they already have x amount of users going on the platform all the time, and they give stories natural promotions. So it's not paid promotions or anything like that. It's just naturally within the app. If a story starts doing well, they promote it, then they promote it more and more. And but you every app has its system and algorithms. So for instance, with Web Novel, you vote for your favorite story. And at the time, I was the first person who said, okay, if you vote for my story and it gets X amount of votes, then I will write more chapters. So I was the first person who did that, and now everyone does it. But you're working within that app. So then, because it got voted, it got to number one. The app pushed my Vampire System more, and then Web Novel did a load of external advertisements. They paid for New York Billboard and just ads on Instagram and all these sorts of websites. And now with Pocket FM, they've created like live action adverts that they just plaster everywhere, all about everywhere. So personally, I haven't paid for any adverts, but these platforms, because the series has been doing well on all of them, they've just been really promoting it.
And that's actually really great because to your point, if you're on Amazon, that's all up to you as the writer to market it, get it visibility, go into platforms, ask people to even read it. And so having a system that'll help get you visibility, because discoverability is probably the most challenging part. But having a platform that organically does that for you, I think allows you to focus on writing more than, okay, now I have to be this business person and turn into running a business and marketing. And how do I do that and not lose money
Yeah.
while I'm doing it? How do you see the web novel industry evolving in the future? Or have there been changes now that you're seeing that you think are giving you hints to where it's going in the future?
It's this whole entertainment industry. It's in a strange spot after COVID because everyone saw. It was like there's just on these apps. They're more like technology companies rather than publishers. So it's all about growth, and there was like regular growth happening year on year, and then when COVID happened, everyone shot up, spiked massively, and then after COVID, everything's dropped because people going outside again, things like that. So then it looks like degrowth because it wasn't at COVID times, but it actually isn't if you compare like numbers before COVID and after COVID. And that's kind of the struggle with all these all these apps, Webtoons, the comic space, everything is struggling with at the moment because they saw those huge numbers. I think the way I think web novel at the moment, the way they're focusing on partnerships and adaptations. So they partnered in audiobook, which it brings in another audience. If they adapt it into comics, that brings in a bigger audience. If they adapt it into anime or TV, then that will bring even more people. That's how Webtoon Naver did really well in Korea. They adapted a load of their comics into live action series. People watch live action and go like, "Oh, you know what? I want to see the original." And it's happened the same with the audiobook. Pocket FM released the audiobook. A lot of people were like, "I want to see the original raw text form. I don't want to listen to audio." So the audio sales go up. Other than that, it's really hard because there's this learning curve in whole web novel space, and especially with the monetization. Like I said, everyone wants a subscription model because that's what we're used to, is paying for a subscription. And then but it's in that phase where subscription doesn't really work at the moment because of the it would need a larger massive amount of numbers, which is why it works for Kindle Unlimited and things like that, but not quite web novels. And even then, because web novel did try the subscription space, but then there's this whole problem of, well, then how are you going to pay the creators, and how do the creators feel? So what happened was when they switched to a subscription model, was the top creators were earning less. And it's like, because then they have to decide how much goes to the top creators, but the
Uh-huh.
top creators are bringing in 98% of the audience. So it's really, yeah, it's a really tricky part. I think growth at the moment is going to be adaptations going forward, and
Hmm.
then maybe bringing in some big authors to try the web novel format.
So you have several series that are out. Do you have anything new that you're working on that you're just really excited about? And you don't have to give away any details, but for your new projects, are you going into a web novel format, or are you thinking of doing something totally different and breaking that trend and, I don't know, writing poetry?
I mean, I say this because web novel made my career. I will always have one story on web novel. So at the moment, I have Dark Magus Returns on web novel. I I am also trying other things because with this, as an author, I don't want all my eggs in one basket. You never know if a certain company behind that is gonna go bust or suddenly just shut down one day, and you want people to follow you, which is why I like using things like Patreon. I like using Discord, Facebook to build this
Mhm.
community that are following you. And then that way, no matter where you are, you still have that core audience that can follow and support you. So, but in terms of stories wise, yeah, I wanted to do a story about Arthur, the vampire punisher in Vampire System. I want to I do want to explore the self-publishing Amazon space because the good thing
Yeah.
is now I have that audience. I didn't before, so I've got that audience from web novel. Would love to try the self-publishing space. I don't think I would. It's a balance with things. It's a balance because web novel is definitely a lot more demanding compared to novels. Like, oh, I can write once a week or I can write a big chunk when I can. Whereas web novels, you do really have to write every day. So I would love in the future that I wouldn't have to write every day.
That, I mean, it's, yeah, that's a lot of work, but it's, in this case, it's paid off for you, and it's built a following, and you actually have done something that so many people are trying to do, which is own the connection to the audience versus having to always have an intermediary between. So that's where things like, to your point, Patreon come into play, or Discords, because I consult with writers and filmmakers and you name it, types of creators all the time. And one of the difficulties is that I'm on Facebook and my stuff's not getting seen, or I did this, but I always have to give half the revenue back to whomever, or oh no, Facebook is down and I can't actually talk to my audience, or if I do this, it gets taken down and no one sees it. But when you've been able to move to a platform where you could now own that relationship with minimal friction in between, it does allow you more flexibility and the ability to write or to create a novel, maybe through Amazon. So
I was gonna say on that point, there is something that really it bugs me sometimes. So I have a friend who has like millions of followers on TikTok and stuff like that, but they follow him because of his reaction content. But because of his followers, he gets a lot of deals with Amazon and things like that. But then when his stories come out, they don't sell very well because, and I try and explain to them, it's like, well, it's because they're following you for your reaction content. They're not following you as an author, right? And you can even see that because if you see the engagement on his post when he's promoting stuff and things like that, the true fans compared to free fans that you can get from making TikToks and Instagram, and because a follow is free, right?
Hmm.
And it makes a big difference. Like even that person with 1 million followers starts up a Patreon, and then he only gets like 10 donors and stuff like that. But it's really annoying because the a lot of executives in this space, it seems like they just look or get hung up on the number and then see like, oh, but he's got 200,000 followers, that'd be great, we can bring him on board. And then it's like me, it's like, oh, but I have real sales stats that I can share with share with anyone. It's like, and every book has been I can give you hard numbers, but then if they come look at my author account or my Instagram, they'll see, oh, you only got 10,000 followers. It's like, yeah, but my book has 2 million followers. It's like, you know, so it's just something I just wanted to vent out that frustration that's quite frustrating as a creator sometimes, where like you said, yeah, just where I see other people getting opportunities because of this huge follower count, but it's not. And sometimes I think other authors look up to that and think, oh, they must be doing really well, but because they've got all these followers and things like that. And it's like you got to be really careful between building a true following of hardcore fans, which takes years. You don't just release a book and then get a true fan from day one. It's the following of like they've really followed you for this whole, like you said, which is why web novels are so great for that. It's like a true following.
You mentioned something that I tell a lot of my clients and that I talk about a lot, and it's the idea of when they're trying to get their movie sold and I'm helping them build an audience so that they can talk to a bank or a distributor or a studio, whoever. One of the things that I always get asked is, well, how can you get me to 1 million followers or 100,000 followers really fast? And truth be told, the bank doesn't care if you have 1 million followers. What they care about is how much money you can make and if you can pay back your loan. And the goal is to get you the right followers, the followers who will go to your movie when it comes out. You can have 1 million followers, but if only 10 of them show up, it's not very helpful, right? But if you have 5,000 and 4,000 of them show up, that's a much more impressive showing. And at the end of the day, it's if you're doing it as part of a business, you want to make sure that you're considering that. And it goes back to, again, you're building a relationship with that audience. If you think of them like a consumer, you're selling a consumer product. You're building a relationship. You have to build trust. You have to give them a reason to want to come back. You have to give them a reason to want to pay. And I think with what you're doing, that you're seeing that firsthand is that you're doing that. And you're able to move with the audience and ask your audience, "Hey, I'm going to do blah blah blah. Can you come support me on my Patreon? Or I want to start working on this. Can you?" They'll do that because you built a relationship and you built trust with them. But to just be an influencer, and not to say that there's anything wrong with an influencer, but
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
different relationship, right? And it's not like you go with your coworkers and you expect them to have the same familiarity that you would with your wife. They're different relationships, right? And so it's the same thing when you're thinking of how you're building an audience. You have to have and know the confines and parameters of that relationship before you act on it. And I think it's hard for brands because they're just pressed for it. Let's just do the thing and say the numbers and we can say we had something versus learning the space and actually understanding how can they get the most out of it.
Like you said that as well, it's really weird because at the beginning you said people describe this as like niche spaces, and it's like it's hard to call it niche when my vampire system has like 400 million views if you include the
Right.
audiobook. So and then like like the sales numbers and and everything. And even if you look at lit RPGs at the charts at the moment, I think the top three in action adventure are all lit RPGs. So it's really weird to call it a niche space when they're outselling traditional bigger authors. And yeah, so it's really quite crazy. But to the more traditional markets, it really feels like web novels at the moment is in the same space YouTube was a long time ago, where no one really knew how much YouTubers made. No one really knew what they were doing. So if you said to someone, I'm a YouTuber, they'd be like, oh, what's that? But now most kids want to grow up being a YouTuber. So I really think web novel at the moment is in web novel, Royal Road, all those type of authors. It's like they're not seen as real authors, which is really strange. Because considering, like, well, what do you consider? For me, a professional is whoever can make a living out of doing it for make a living off doing it. That's a professional to me. So yeah, it's really weird how there will be this view of like, oh, can I buy your book in the bookstore? It's like, no, you can't. Oh, okay. then you're not really an author. So yeah.
Did you know that bookstores are closing? Just so you guys, that's one of the questions, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Have you run into that where you're talking to other writers or authors and you get a little bit of the distance with like, oh well, you're not really an author like us, or I got that a little bit with photography when I used to do that for magazines, and you're not, oh, you don't do film, oh right, and it was right when digital was happening, and I'm thinking, well, I mean, soon everyone's going to be doing digital, and like the really older, powerful people didn't like doing digital, where they had these
Yeah.
big film things and scan them, and so there was always like, oh, that's so cute. We did a digital photo, right?
Yeah, it's really weird because I remember there's a author community group and they do things via tiers of based off your earnings. And it was like to get in this prestigious group, you had to have X amount of earnings, and then you would go up the tiers and stuff like that. And then you could talk to other authors. So it'd be great. It's like you can talk to the biggest authors as long as you earn the same amount as them. And then I remember you have to send proofs of your income. And I sent mine, which would have got me into the top tiers, but then they were like, "Oh, we don't count web novel income." What was it? It's like, that doesn't really make sense. So it's really strange. And in person with my friends and family, it's like they don't really understand it. But at the end of the day, I think what does make sense to them is the fact that, look, I can do it full time. I bought my house with it. I bought my cars with it. I support my whole family with it. So that aspect they can understand them through that. But yeah, I feel like sometimes it won't be real to them until it moves over to a media. That's what I was saying. Like, if it moved over to a TV type form media, then they'll be like, "Oh, okay, now I really see that you're you're doing real things." Even though it was like, well, I was doing real things from the beginning, but yeah,
Yeah, it's funny. When I first started working in digital media, I worked for a couple of really big YouTube companies. And so just anyone who was really big, YouTube at the time had been part of our network. And I remember telling my mom about it. And she was like, what's the YouTube? I don't even get what this is. And then I moved to a new company and we were still doing YouTube. And I happened to done a couple Facebook videos with a small group of like five of us, and we two of them went super viral. Where like celebrities were just sharing it. And my mom sends me a text message, "Oh, you have to watch this video. It's really funny." And she sent it to me, and it was mine. And I was like, "I did
yeah,
that."
yeah.
And she laughed. That's not you. It's funny, right? I'm like, no, it's really. She's like, no, it was on Facebook. But she just didn't believe that I had anything to do with
Yeah. Do you know what's interesting? What you say well is actually authors get hung up on it as well. So even if their example, I have an artist friend who does the artwork for one of our comics, but it's only online. It's only on Webtoon, and to him, it's like, oh, he wants a book in a store. He wants a physical manga book in the store, and for him, it doesn't feel real. And it's like, you do know you have a bigger audience online. You get paid more from Webtoon, and you have more chance of it being turned into TV series at the moment from that. And it was like, actually books in bookstores don't do that well. Even in the author world, it's something like you're lucky to get 12 book sales if your book ends up in a bookstore, and people actually live off the advances rather than the royalties. But for some reason they'll be hung up on that. So even if they're earning really well on web novel, they'll be hung up on like, I want to get my book in a bookstore. So it kind of works both ways sometimes.
I feel like it's very common. There's been these traditional marks of prestige and success in the past. And a lot of filmmakers, I have to have my movie in a theater. It has to be in cinemas, but you'll make just as much money if Netflix pays you or if it's
Yeah.
on Amazon. No, no, but it has to be in a theater. We probably lose money. You won't even get a wide release, but it has to be in the theater. And I've seen authors do the same thing. Some who I refuse to self publish. I have to be published by a major publishing house and have it in a bookstore, and goal is not necessarily getting your story out to the world, and it's not necessarily even the finance. It seems like when that's the conversation, it's the prestige or what that represents,
Yeah.
which is it's hard to overcome when you've grown up and kind of built your career around that thing being pinnacle of success.
The other thing is, though, all that stuff can come later if with a natural progression. It's like if you write something popular online, then it will get picked up, and then so example, like I said, I was really into comics. Now I just write novels. They get so popular that comic companies come to you and then want to publish it, and then so you don't have to go straight for. This happens all the time as well. Is authors are like, I want to make I want my book to become anime. And it's like, focus on the book. Don't focus, like,
Mm.
and that's their goal straight away. It's like, I want my book's going to become a movie, and it's like, focus on the book doing well, and then go into those things. Like, it's great to have big goals, but they're always talking about the thing after rather than the current product.
Amazingly, you need the story and the book first.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. This has been great. It's been really enlightening. I really appreciate you taking time to chat, especially right after traveling. So I really think it's really generous of you to give your time like that. And I look forward to reading more of your books and hopefully seeing really big things from you in the future.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, and hopefully I do have bigger news in the future as well.